My guest today is Dr. Brendan Newlon, and he has a PhD in religious studies, not an expert in knowledge graphs, but an expert in networks. So he's moving into graphing methods in order to represent some of the things that he researched in his PhD. So we'll hear from him about communities and the structure that he was studying in his PhD, as well as an analytical process that he created. So Brendan, right, you're the expert. Tell us about your background and your work in community.
I'll start with my dissertation research was in religious studies. I was focused on Muslim communities in the US, and I sort of made some comparisons with Muslim communities and how networks of Muslims evolved in China, like historically. So I was able to find some parallels there. And at the time, what I was trying to do was to describe what was intuitive to me when I saw different communities, which was that they're different. It's hard to put your finger on how and why they're different, but somebody who's really immersed would be able to immediately recognize that difference in a variety of ways. So what I ended up building in an enormous Google spreadsheet was with equations to move data from one place to another, that it was so complicated and huge that it took Google Sheets like 10 minutes to update for any change that was made. And I wish that I'd known about graph databases at the time, because that would have actually made it work. But I came up with the model that there's really three things going on when you talk about community. There are the types of discourse that makes that community have something to talk about with each other. And there's the networks of who it is that they're talking with and who they're not talking with. And then there's sort of an aesthetic quality where you represent your identity as being a part of that community through some style, right? Whether it's sacred symbols or clothing you wear or ways that you speak, it signals that you belong to this community rather than some other community, and so that other people in your community can recognize you and find you. I started with the online public biographies of famous Muslims in the US and traced absolutely everything that they mentioned in their biography. Like, this is what they wanted to be known about them, right? Okay. That was me reading ahead. So this was my equation. Community is discourse, networks, and style. Here's somebody who is a very famous Muslim in the US, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. He teaches at Zaytuna College in Berkeley, and a lot of other places, and does a lot of other things. But since he was a very prominent person, I start with him. And here was his first degree network. Here are all the teachers that were mentioned on his biography at the time, schools that he attended, anything like that, organizations where, he had some role, he was on a board or something like that. His second degree network starts to get really complicated, and a lot of the other well-known figures were mentioned.
So how would you
This
describe,
is his third degree network.
How would you describe second and third degree network? What does that mean?
Oh, so your immediate friends, the people you know, are your first degree network, or your contacts. Their contacts are your second degrees. So if Sheikh Hamza knows Sheikh Mendez, and Sheikh Mendez is mentioned on his biography, if we go to Sheikh Mendez's biography and see who he mentions, that's Sheikh Hamza's second degree.
Right. Okay.
Right. And when we follow all of them one level further, his third degree was really huge. And this was the whole network. If you follow all of those biographies, every single dot on there, except maybe the outermost ones that have only a single connection, it doesn't change all that much, right? You can see that it's dense, it's highly connected, right?
Yes.
And you sort of reach a closing point. Most of these people in the outside layer are less known and foreign teachers
Okay.
that no one else had mentioned, right? That nobody else in this whole network had mentioned.
Hmm.
So I didn't pursue it any further than that.
It's like a more niche interest, like, oh, I know about this particular author who's
Yeah,
in the space, but yeah, I draw on him or something.
exactly. So this was sort of the professional public network, of that community.
Hmm.
And here's a different Muslim community. Uh, I say in the US, but really it's international, but I was focusing on folks who were publishing or popular in the US. And you can see it's also pretty dense, also very interconnected internally,
Hmm.
right? And if you put both of them together, this is what you get. So isolated from each other that the only connections between those two communities were a few random things like a person from this network and from that network both attended Wayne State University. And yeah, it may not have been at the same time. They
Hmm.
didn't know each other. They didn't study the same thing, but they just, maybe somebody studied economics and somebody else did something else. But Wayne State University is the node that connects these two networks.
Okay.
And just a few other things like that. And I thought that was incredible, given how dense and how tightly and multiply interconnected each network is. The fact that they're so intentionally separate from each other is a major statement that each one is making, right? We are not them,
Right.
right?
So they are
We're
aware
us and we are
of
not
each
them.
other. They would have had the opportunity to meet potentially, but refused to
Absolutely.
connect. Okay.
Yeah, this would be like if IBM or Microsoft and Apple
Hmm.
never mentioned each other ever publicly online.
Oh,
Like
wow.
never mention each other's names ever, right? They're working in the same space. They're
Uh-huh.
competing for the same customers, right? The same followers, and yet they never mention each other.
So so where does this go from what you've done in your PhD into knowledge graphs?
Right. So I wish I'd had a knowledge graph at the time, but
Mhm.
when I started my postdoc, we wanted to be more intentional. I was doing research on how a major philanthropy in the Jewish nonprofit space could better support their network, their sector. And so one of the things I did to begin with was I did a prototype mapping funding networks in the Jewish nonprofit space. So here are just a few of like the largest by dollar amount funders who sort of list themselves or are identified as Jewish funders. And if I were to redo this, I would have been more careful to find funders who are not just labeled as Jewish funders, but rather funders of Jewish nonprofit organizations, right?
Mhm.
So there's a lot of difference there. You can see here the green and blue blobs at the bottom. These are two very large funders that work in LA. And so the overlap between them, the nonprofit organizations that they both fund are mostly ones that are like just nonprofits in LA, not necessarily Jewish focused nonprofits, just anything, hospitals, schools, museums, anything.
Mhm.
And uh, remind me if I forgot to even explain when I first showed this what it was. The center nodes here are the funders, and the spokes coming off that are connected to them are the nonprofits they fund. So uh, I wanted to think about how else we could organize and describe a network in the nonprofit space. So I looked at what the IRS uses, which is called the National Taxonomy for Exempt Entities, NTE. And they have sort of a letter and number taxonomy that describes any nonprofit according to what type it is and what their topical focus is. So maybe topic A, I think, is arts and cultures. You may be able to see the screen better than I can from this view, but and then after that, A1 might be museums, A02 might be, history museums or art museums, or and it breaks it down like that.
Right.
And there's another section of that taxonomy that deals with the type of organization it is. Are you a nonprofit that redistributes any funds you get to other nonprofits? Or are you a nonprofit that advocates for certain something, right? Or that does direct work with the public, or just like a community center. So what I did with this was I broke this apart into sort of those different parts, the way that it's classified, that taxonomy breaks down, and I represented it as a network. So the ones you see at the center here, those are the, I think, 5 or so main types of organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And branching off of those, the red nodes, I think, are the letter codes. So arts and cultures, maybe health, etc., education. And then breaking off of that are the subcategories.